So, am I the only one who thinks Canute is kind of strange? Don't get me wrong, I love Canute. Everything he does in Season 1 is awesome, from preaching about paradise on Earth, to saying hugs not drugs to a mad Viking tripping on shrooms. And he even has some great parallels to Thorfinn, which I do want to talk about later in the video. But first I want to try and answer this one question that's been bothering me. What exactly is Canute's role in the farm arc? Also, it should go without saying that this discussion will contain spoilers. Now, I know this is kind of a weird question to ask, because it's like, well, he's important either way, so what's the difference? Which I do agree, Canute is obviously important. But here's the problem. The farm arc centers around Thorfinn's inner conflict. I'm not going to put a label on it like man versus self or man versus whatever, but at the end of the day, it's Thorfinn confronting his guilt. It starts with Thorfinn and his nightmares, and it ends with Thorfinn vowing to create a paradise in Vinland. Okay, so when that is the case, when that is the whole point of this arc, then it's like, where does Canute fit in all of this? And it's when you ask this question that you start to realize how oddly structured this arc is. Because Canute is the one behind most of the conflict in this arc, but he also has nothing to do with Thorfinn's inner conflict. That's not something he caused, and it's not even something he's particularly invested in. And that's how you come to this weird split of, well, he's important, but I really don't know why. Unfortunately, it only gets worse when you try and put a label on what his role is supposed to be in this arc. You know, now that I say this out loud, this sounds like a very open-minded video. Like, ugh, it's 2023, why do we have to put a label on it? But anyway, let's try and figure out what his role is, sort of, so we can understand exactly why Canute is so important. We can cross off main character, duh. Deuteragonist? No, that would be Einar. You could call him a tertiary character, but like, so isn't Fox, so that's a dumb answer. Love interest? Maybe if we were in Season 1, and it was called Canute-san Can't Communicate. Alright, so then why don't we try villain? And for those of you who are like, wait, dude, what are you talking about? Let's go over some of the villain level stuff he's done. He had the King of England poisoned and made it look like a disease. He did the same thing to the king's son, and he did the same thing to his brother. That is some Dio level evil right there. And yet, Canute doesn't quite fit the bill. See, there's villains and then there's the villain. Everyone has their own ideas of villains, but when we're talking about the villain of a story, or the villain of an arc, it usually means something specific. If you're a Dr. Stone fan, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. See, a lot of people like to say Tsukasa isn't really the villain of the Stone Wars, because deep down he's a good guy. But that misses the point of a villain. A villain is the character who, in one way or another, drives the plot of the story with their schemes or actions. In Dr. Stone, Senku is forced to form an alliance that can stop Tsukasa from killing half the population. The bad guy does the bad thing, and the good guy does the good thing to stop the bad guy in the bad thing. But in the farm arc, it's more like Canute does the bad thing while Thorfinn does his own thing. Think about it. What does Canute do? He poisons people for political power. Okay, nothing to do with Thorfinn. He then puts forth a diabolical scheme to force a wealthy farmer into opposing him so that he can justifiably appropriate his property and further secure his political power. Surely that must make him the villain of this arc, right? Well, yes and no. If you view this storyline as part of the main events of this arc, then I guess you could technically call Canute the villain. But here's where it gets messy. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you've been enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, who is the main character? It's Thorfinn. Okay, and what conflict is Thorfinn faced with? Well, point A, he starts with his nightmares and trying to figure out what the point of living is. He ends on point B, deciding that you should live for the future and that he wants to go to Vinland. In that arc, nothing that Canute does has anything to do with it. Thorfinn's nightmares? That's just natural. The whole incident with Arnhide's husband? Also not Canute. The whole storyline of Kettle going to the capital and Canute invading his farm, it's almost completely separate from the Thorfinn storyline. The only part where Canute comes into this is the fact that his plan makes Kettle go crazy. So you could argue that Kettle would never have hurt Arnhide if it weren't for Canute. But at the same time, it's just as likely that Kettle would have reacted that way when he learned Arnhide tried to leave. regardless of whatever was going on with Canute. So the only real case for Canute being the villain is when Thorfinn has to negotiate with Canute to get him to leave the farm, but by then Thorfinn has already gone through most of the main conflict. A conflict that has everything to do with Thorfinn's own inner struggle, and evidently almost nothing to do with any of Canute's plans. When so little of this main conflict can be traced back to Canute's actions or motivations, it's kind of hard to call him the villain. Is it completely unreasonable? No, but it's certainly a stretch. But what if we dialed it back? What if, instead of a villain, we looked at Canute as an antagonist? The only real difference between an antagonist and a villain is that the former just opposes the main character, while the latter does something to put the plot in motion. Even if Canute doesn't exactly set the events of the farm arc in motion, it still seems like he's in opposition to Thorfinn. In fact, their whole reunion centers around Thorfinn having to overcome Canute's goals. So obviously, Canute must be an antagonist, right? Well, also, yes and no. On one hand, Thorfinn and Canute are sort of in opposition. Thorfinn wants to practice peace and non-violence, and Canute wants to wage war so that he can put an end to war. So at least ideologically, the two seem to be in conflict. But let's go back to the Dr. Stone example for a quick second. Senku and Tsukasa are also ideologically opposed. Senku thinks science should be used to save everyone. Tsukasa thinks that half the population should be wiped out and that science needs to be restricted. But it's not like they just agree to disagree. Tsukasa kills Senku, and not like metaphorically, he literally kills him because he wanted to stop his plans. He then proceeds to send a small army and a spy to stop Senku once he realizes that he managed to survive. In this sense, Tsukasa is actually opposing what Senku is trying to do. When we look at Canute, he isn't really trying to oppose Thorfinn. Like I said, the whole take over Kettle Farm plan has almost nothing to do with Thorfinn reflecting on his past, finding his new meaning for living, and deciding to go to Vinland. It is only until their reunion when Thorfinn makes the effort to stop Canute. But at that point, the arc is basically over and Thorfinn's inner conflict has pretty much been resolved. So again, it wouldn't be unreasonable to call Canute an antagonist, but it certainly seems like it's not exactly the best fit. And at this point, Canute might seem kind of pointless. He's not a deuteragonist, he's not the villain, and he's not really an antagonist. But there is one thing that, once you put a name to it, everything suddenly falls into place. What Canute really serves as in this arc is a foil. He is Thorfinn's foil, and in more ways than you might think. They both have, let's say, a lack of a father figure, except Thorfinn has multiple role models while Canute's actual father haunts him like he's a Shakespeare character. They both have the same scar below their eye, except Thorfinn gave Canute his, which only adds to the weird influence they have on each other. There's also the fact that they're both haunted by dead people, except Thorfinn is haunted by the countless number of people he killed, while Canute is only haunted by his father, who he didn't actually kill. And of course, they have their different approaches to creating paradise on Earth. So all in all, Canute really is just a foil in this arc. He's not the villain, nothing he does really influences the main conflict of this arc, that being Thorfinn's inner struggle. He also doesn't do anything to oppose that inner struggle. That struggle is pretty much resolved, at least in this arc, by the time Canute shows up to the farm. Canute's only real role in this arc is his role as the foil to Thorfinn. At the most basic level, Canute is there to contrast the non-violent tone of Thorfinn's motivation. But beyond that, they have this very strange dynamic. And that is why I said at the beginning that Canute is a strange character. At his core, he wants the same thing as Thorfinn, putting an end to war and slavery. And yet at the same time, he and Thorfinn couldn't be more different. It's not to say Canute is a poorly written character. In fact, I think Canute is a great character because of his unique role in the unique story that is Vinland Saga. But maybe you disagree. Maybe you really do think Canute is a villain. Or maybe you think he's something else that I never mentioned. Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on the community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my previous video on Thorfinn. In that video, I explain why Thorfinn is a great character even though he can be kind of boring in this arc. You can find it in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.